Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be starting our coverage of the London Chess Classic. If you're not too familiar, this is the third leg of the race in the Grand Chess Tour. Now, this is an inaugural tournament. So it started this year. There's 3 legs. We have the Norway Chess Tournament, we have the Sinquefield Cup, and lastly we have the London Chess Classic. So this is the third and final one of the year. And what they do is they take 9 of the top players in the world. They're going to be the same in each of the tournaments. They'll add on 1 additional player, so there's even players throughout. So each of these tournaments will have 10 players, and then based on how you do in that tournament, you'll get points. Now, going into the London Chess Classic, the top 5 players, just so you kind of know how they have ranked based on Norway and the Sinquefield Cup, is Topalov is number 1, Nakamura in number 2, Aronian number 3, Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, number 4, and Anish Giri in 5th place. And then you have 6th through 9th. So with that said, the London Chess Classic is a pretty fun tournament, and there's $1 million in the Grand Chess Tour, so a really fun way to get the top players to be playing consistently against each other. So that's kind of an intro into the London Chess Classic. In round 1 today, this is a 9-day event. We're going to be looking at the leader, Topalov, and he's going to be playing the white pieces, Bulgarian chess grandmaster. He's going to be playing Anish Giri, 21-year-old Dutchman, really phenomenal player. He's currently in 5th in the overall standings for the entire Grand Chess Tour. So a really good way to kind of kickstart off the London Chess Classic with 2 of the powerhouses going into this last leg of the race. So we'll go ahead and get started with pawn to d4, knight to f6, a pawn c4, pawn to g6, pawn here to g3. So it somewhat looks like a Grunfeld defense with this pawn here to g6, knight to f6, but we kind of see the fianchetto version of pawn here to g3 and then pawn to c6. A little bit of a variation instead of the just normal pawn here to d5 in the Grunfeld, but we see pawn here to c6, bishop here to g2, that fianchetto, and now pawn here to d5. Now white's going to play queen to a5. It's a little questionable as far as if white's going for maybe a Catalan opening or if he's just really playing against the Grunfeld defense. But we see knight to d7 from Anish Giri, and this is the move that Boris Gelfand has played himself, and so a lot more grandmasters are starting to play this. So you're seeing this more often, where back in the day you didn't see this often at all. Topalov decides to go ahead and take with this pawn here on d5. Other moves, instead of taking with a pawn, you could always play queen back here to b3, c2. Those are popular moves as well. But after pawn takes, now we see the knight coming over here to b6, and then the queen's going to retreat back here to d1, and then the pawn takes here on d5. From here, we see the c file open, so both sides are going to continue to develop their pieces. Knight here to c3, knight c6, and then pawn here to e3. And there's a few ways that white can kind of play this. He decides to go ahead and solidify his pawn chain, but it does block off his dark square bishop. So Topalov's going to have to keep that in mind the rest of the game as far as how he wants to get this bishop here on c1 involved into the game. We see bishop here to g7, fianchetto getting ready to castle on the king side. Knight here to e2. Wants to make sure his light square bishop is still involved, not blocked off, with the knight here on f3, which is the normal move for the knight always to come here to f3, but then castle on the king side, castle over here, and then rook over here to e8. We have seen previous matches, even earlier in this year, of black playing pawn here to e6, just solidifying the pawn chain just like white did, but Anish Giri doesn't want to block off his light square bishop. He has bigger plans for his light square bishop. He wants to later get his bishop involved to g4, really devastating move to pin down this knight here on e2. He wants to bring it potentially to f5, control the center of the board. He doesn't want to block it off because he realizes that it's just going to be kind of tedious. He wants instead to kind of push forward with pawn to e5. But before he does that, he first needs to go and bring his rook over here to e8, giving some protection right here. So pawn here to b3. This just kind of consolidates a knight coming here to a4, this c4 square as well. Also opens up the door for the dark square bishop, knowing that it's kind of blocked off with the pawn chain here on e3, d4, and f2. He can't really go anywhere productive. Doesn't want to block off his queen from moving. So opening up the door with pawn here to b3 is pretty nice all the way around. And now pawn to e5, as we kind of talked about. After the pawn takes, now the knight recaptures here on e5. I personally wouldn't mind the bishop here on e5. it does threaten pins down this knight to this rook back here on a1. I think that's fine. Also, just kind of keeping the fianchetto bishop back here is kind of a safe move. Your opponent is always going to have to be thinking about the rest of the game because it just controls so much of the board. So knight taking on the center of the board, and then we see pawn to h3. Now white has a ton of different options. If you look at this, you may look and say, okay, black has an isolated pawn here on d5, so white wants to put a lot of pressure on that square. He already has one knight, one bishop, and a queen, and if you look at black's defense, he has one queen and one knight here on b6. Unfortunately, can't just take right away. So if we first look at the bishop ticking here on d5, then the knight takes, and then all of a sudden the queen takes. But then the bishop coming down here to h4 is pretty devastating as far as what white really wants to do on board. It could just go ahead and take this queen, but then after the rook, it's going to be very difficult. As soon as this knight comes down here to f3 check, all of a sudden that's going to just open up the door for this knight to be attacked, or this rook back here on a1 if this knight moves. Now if we kind of look at it here, after the bishop takes, and the knight comes back here, then the knight's going to come here to f3 check, and then just opens up the door for the bishop to come down here to a1. And then, you know, the king could come here, we could just take extra material, and then it doesn't really matter. The bishop could just come down here and take, and the knight could come off the board from the king, but you kind of get the point. So, you can imagine Topalov decides not to go ahead and do that. He didn't really quite like that. Instead decided to go for the h3 there. But he could have also even tried a knight to d5, but this is probably even worse. You see the knight take here on d5, queen takes, we could see the queen capture, bishop, and then something similar, but the bishop coming down here to h3. Doesn't really have to move his rook, but if he wanted to, you know, bishop here first, we could see the bishop take down here on f1. All in all, this is going to be not quite as good for white. So if we come back, that's just some of the variations. There's a lot of other moves that could have occurred on the board, but that's some of the ones that you could have seen. So instead, we see a pawn to h3, and this stops the bishop coming down here to g4, which is a very troublesome move for Topalov to have to deal with. So instead, Nishijiri says, okay, I'll go ahead and go with the second best square, and that's the bishop here to f5, just controlling the center of the board, and then we see knight up here to d4. Topalov's main goal right now is still to threaten this pawn here on d5. It's an isolated pawn. Nishijiri really has to put a lot of resources to go ahead and try to defend that. So putting more and more pressure on that is definitely going to be white's kind of objective right now. On the other side, black's doing pretty good. He has both of his bishops in the center of the board. They're very active compared to his opponent, where the dark square bishop's not really doing anything. It's going to be a little bit easier for him to go ahead and get his rooks involved into the game. Rook over here to c8, controlling the c file. White can't really get his A1 rook really involved into the game. So both sides kind of clear as far as what they're going to be trying to do. Bishop down here to d3, attacking the rook. The rook's going to come over here to e1. Now the bishop comes back here to a6, and the queen's forced to come here to d2. Why is it forced to come here to d2? Because this next move, knight here to d3, attacking the rook. The rook really needs an outlet. Without this queen moving, can't really come here to d1. So queen here, d1, and then all of a sudden bishop to d4. Nishijiri says, I'm going to go ahead and give you a double bishop pair. I think I can continue to put pressure on board, so I'm going to go ahead and give up this bishop here on d4. And it also does give Nishijiri a target here. So white also has an isolated pawn on the d file. This also opens up the door for another open file on the e file. So if Nishijiri wanted to, he could come over to c8, have two open files that he's continuously attacking with both of his rooks. Now Nishijiri is going to get his queen involved, so queen here to f6, and then a pawn up here to a4. Now this is a pretty sharp move. Topalov is known for playing these sharper moves, getting in these crazy complications. It's definitely fun for spectators. It's really taxing on your brain, which is why I was kind of surprised almost to see it in game one. usually see some games very passive in game one. Everyone kind of going for the draw, just go on to later rounds and just kind of see where you are and see if you need to start making some moves. But you don't want to make any crazy waves going on. You could easily just play something a little bit more basic. Bishop here to f1, start to put more pressure, pinning down this knight here to this bishop. This knight really can't really do too much, and start to maybe add more pressure on here. You have your queen attacking this. This is completely fine, I think. But pawn to a4, very aggressive play. Now the queen comes down, takes this isolated pawn. That was kind of what Nishijiri was kind of looking to do. So black is currently up a pawn, but it's going to be very easy for Topalov to kind of get that back. But now decides to play pawn here to a5. Now, if you kind of look at it and say, you know, why don't we just see the bishop to f1, just starts to kind of overload this piece here on d3. Black actually has a pretty nice defense to this, and you can see both players kind of studying the board just to kind of see how all the permutations would kind of play out. But after knight here to d7, if you do see the bishop take here on d3, we see the bishop come down after the queen takes. There's a nice in-between move that black has, and it's rook here to e1. And this is kind of the reason that Topalov decided not to go ahead and play this bishop here to f1, because this rook to e1 is just kind of puts the whole plan to a halt right here. The rook can't take here because then his queen's going to fall, so he kind of has to play his king here to g2, and then we see the rook take, the queen take, and then the queen take here on c3. White just doesn't really have any compensation for what he was trying to do. So after all this, we don't see that on the board. Instead, we see pawn to a5, forcing the knight back to a d7 right away. Now rook up here to a4. So if we look at Topalov, his game plan, it was to attack the isolated pawn. If that's plan A, his plan B looks to be to go ahead and get his rook involved, swing it over to the king side, and start to have an aggressive attack on his opponent's king side of the board. So that's plan B. So queen back here to e5. The queen was being attacked, so definitely needs to move. And then knight taking up here on a d7. And now the knight's going to come back here to c1. Now, a lot of the grandmasters that were doing commentary on this game were a little disappointed that Nishijiri kind of jumped the gun and played knight to c1. Instead, really wanted to see knight to c5, getting another piece involved into the game, controlling the center of the board, and still adding pressure of this d3 square, which is, as you can tell, kind of blocking off a lot of the key pieces for white. So really would have been nice to see Nishijiri play this, but kind of opted for the easier move, but I don't feel like it's as good, and that is the knight taking here on c1. The rook takes here on c1, and then the knight over here to f6. Yeah, it's a little better position than it was here on d7, but really it's just not nearly as good if it was kind of controlling this area of the board. So Topalov plays knight to c7. He's really starting to kind of put a stranglehold on this match. Unfortunately, he's running out of time. He only has about 15 minutes left on the game, so it's a somewhat complicated position as far as how you take. He's probably up a little bit just based on where he's at right now. He's attacking both of these these rooks right here, so that's going to be good. Probably a little bit better position. He can swing his rook over and start to get that involved. But it's not very easy. Nishijiri is going to make it very difficult for him to do that, so time is definitely not on his side. Nishijiri plays rook to d8, just centralizing his rooks. It's completely open in the center of the board, so anytime your rooks can control long files, that's always going to be good, and they're connected as well. Queen here to f4. Pawn down here to g5, just threatening the queen. Queen over here to b4. Topalov doesn't yet want to go ahead and give up his advantage. He recognizes that he probably is winning on board right now, and so he doesn't want to just exchange his queens off the board right yet. Queen down here to b2, starting to add pressure. Rook down here to e2. You always want your rooks on your opponent's second rank or seventh rank, depending on which color you are. Queen up here to c5. We see pawn here to h6. Just solidifying this pawn chain. This pawn was being attacked by the queen right here, so just a nice little safe move. Knight over here taking on a6, pawn recapturing. Definitely better for white right here as the double pawns on either the A file or the H file are just really bad, especially if there's no connecting pawns at all or anything to kind of help out and potentially maybe get that non-double pair. So right now, white definitely has the better position on on board. Rook over here to b1, attacking the queen. Queen over here to d2, a bishop here to f3, and then knight to e4. Now Topalov on board, we are at the 32nd move. He only has 2 minutes left in the game, which is unfortunate because it's very difficult. You're now playing almost bullet chess, where your opponent just has so much time to think and you just have to go rapid fire. He plays queen here to a7, and this is a huge mistake. He should have played bishop here to e4. Things would have been completely okay, but he played queen over here to a7. He just probably didn't have time to really look at the move knight to f2, but this is very devastating. Doesn't want to come and take it with his queen. It would just fall right away. So instead decides to go ahead and take the rook. But the knight up here to h3 check. The king's going to move. Queen up here to d5, getting ready to come down here to h1 check. That's a very devastating move. The bishop up here to h5. That's kind of losing. Doesn't really matter, though, where h goes. Anish Juri has enough time on board to really calculate the best move. Probably from here, white needs to go with king to e1. That's really the only way to kind of get out of this mess. Bishop here to h5. Really just opens up the door for black to kind of do whatever he wants to. So queen down here to h1, king up here to e2, queen here to g2. All of a sudden, the rook's going to come over here, just controlling these D and E files. Then the knight's going to come on board, and then all of a sudden we see knight up here to e4, discovered attack with the queen check, and from here Topalov has decided to resign. So with the white pieces coming into the last leg of the Grand Chess Tour, being in first place, and losing the first game is definitely not what he wanted. Anish Juri, though, coming out the blocks with the black pieces, playing arguably the best player at the tournament so far and getting a win. So congratulations to him. Played exceptionally well in a very, very difficult game. So many sharp lines, so many things to think about, so many different traps that both players could really fall into, and really both did extremely well, but just ran out of time at the end. Hopefully y'all enjoyed the video. Had some requests to maybe go a little bit more in depth, so try to do that in this video. I will also try to do that with the rest of the London Chess Classic. Try to go a little bit more in depth into some of the moves, the variations, some of the things that these grandmasters are thinking about, and then add more commentary around what other grandmasters are saying about the game. I'm also watching the games to kind of get a feel for how they're really going. So hopefully you find this both informative and entertaining at the same time. Really looking forward to this last big chess tournament of the year. So make sure that you check out all the videos. We're going to be doing videos from all the rounds. I'll have a lot more material on the chesswebsite.com if you haven't been checking that out as well. So everyone, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in round 2.